There are doors into Harvard that open with admission lists, others with millions in donations. But that night, an unmarked door to the mathematics wing opened with the key of a janitor. The old clock struck twice with a hollow echo. The corridor was silent, save for the pale light of the moon glimmering across the cold stone floor. A frail child stepped in, chalk dust still clinging to his shoulder from his father's worn broom. He did not belong here, or so the world would say. Yet his dark eyes, bright as embers, did not waver. On the blackboard remained symbols unfinished, equations left unresolved by professors earlier that day. The child dragged a chair, climbed up, his small hand trembling but resolute. Each stroke of chalk broke the silence of the night. Screech, screech, screech. At Harvard, where the empire of intellect reigned, no one knew that at precisely 2 a.m., history was about to be rewritten by the hand of a janitor's child. The echo of chalk carried strangely far in that deserted hallway. The boy's strokes were awkward at first, each line etched with hesitation, as though he feared the board might reject him. Yet as the shapes grew, so did his certainty. Numbers, arcs, and letters formed like constellations across the dark expanse. Outside the tall windows, Harvard Yard lay frozen under the moon. Frost glazed the branches, and lamps flickered against the snow. This was a world that had no place for him. A world built on names etched into marble and endowments that could purchase futures. But here, within the quiet chamber of mathematics, status had no meaning. The chalk obeyed only truth. The boy's name was Samuel. No one at Harvard knew it, and if they had, they would have dismissed it as quickly as the rag that wiped their tables. His father, Miguel, spent his nights mopping these very floors, back-bent, hands cracked by bleach and time. Samuel had inherited not wealth nor privilege, but the quiet stubbornness of a man who refused to bow even when invisible. It was not the first night Samuel had slipped through these doors. The ritual had begun weeks ago. He waited until his father, exhausted, returned to their cramped Somerville apartment and collapsed into bed. Then Samuel stole back across the Charles River, slipping through service corridors with the stolen key his father once dropped onto the kitchen table. His heart would thunder in his chest as he pressed the key into the lock. Half certain alarms would sound, but none ever did. The doors of Harvard, shut to him by daylight, yielded silently in the dark. Tonight, though, was different. Tonight, the blackboard bore a problem unlike any he had seen. Lines tangled, chalk dust smudged where frustrated hands had wiped clean and tried again. He recognized fragments of the Navier-Stokes equations, twisted into a problem of turbulence no one in the world had yet untangled. Even at 12 years old, Samuel understood the weight of it. It was one of the great mysteries, carved into the very bones of mathematics. Professors spent decades here and left only with broken chalk. His father's words echoed, "Don't let them see you, son. Harvard is not for us." Yet here Samuel was, chalk between his fingers, standing on a chair stolen from the front row. His chest rose and fell with each breath, but his mind had already left the world of janitors and dormitories. It drifted into the current of equations, where air moved like invisible rivers and numbers bent the laws of flow. The second hand of the old clock trembled forward. The world outside remained locked in silence. Samuel's solution did not appear all at once. It came in whispers. He would write a line, then erase it with the side of his palm. A new idea sparked, then faltered. Sweat trickled down his neck, cold against the drafty window. He bit his lip, pressed harder, until the chalk splintered. He grabbed another piece, almost angry at the fragility of it. In that moment, he was no longer a boy. He was a vessel through which something larger moved, some force that belonged not to wealth or power, but to the fierce hunger of a mind unwilling to bow. And then, A shape emerged. The arc of his proof curved into place like a melody resolving its final note. For hours, the problem had loomed like a beast, unmovable, invincible. Yet beneath his hand, the board transformed into order, each stroke binding chaos into clarity. The last line landed with a whisper of chalk. Samuel stepped back. His knees trembled. The silence felt alive, pressing against him. He could hardly breathe. Had he done it? The board stood there, covered edge to edge in chalk. To anyone else, it was a storm of symbols. To Samuel, it was a map, leading from the impossible to the inevitable. He stared until the shapes blurred. His chest ached. The old clock struck again, 2:30. And in that fragile silence, Samuel allowed himself the smallest smile. No one would ever know. By dawn, the corridors would fill again with professors in polished shoes, students chattering over coffee, and janitors sweeping quietly in their shadow. His father would return to the same mop and bucket, unseen. But for this one moment at 2 a.m., history shifted. Not in the halls of power or the ledgers of donors, but in the trembling hand of a child who dared to claim the blackboard. Samuel climbed down, wiped his fingers against his worn trousers, and placed the stub of chalk back onto the ledge. His eyes lingered on the proof, lit faintly by the moon. Then he slipped back into the shadows, as quietly as he had arrived. The door clicked shut behind him, and the corridor swallowed the secret hole. By day, Harvard's stone walls gleamed with sunlight, but for Samuel they loomed like fortresses. He never entered them in daylight. Instead, he carried their shadow back to Somerville, where the streets narrowed into alleys that smelled of mildew and rust. Home was a single rented room above a laundromat. The ceiling leaked in winter, and the pipes coughed like old men in the dark. His father, Miguel, kept the place as clean as bleach would allow, scrubbing stains no amount of work could erase. At the far corner stood Samuel's desk, if it could be called that. It was a wooden crate balanced on bricks, stacked with notebooks scavenged from trash bins near Harvard dormitories. Pages torn, corners bent, margins filled with other students' doodles. Yet for Samuel, these notebooks were scripture. The boy's body was slight, his ribs visible when he bent forward, but his mind surged with hunger. Not hunger for food, though that gnawed at him often, but hunger for symbols, proofs, patterns that could not be stripped from him. His father watched him sometimes, from the doorway, after returning from a 12-hour shift. Miguel's eyes carried both pride and grief. Pride, because the boy was brighter than the lamps that flickered overhead. Grief, because he knew the world had little patience for brilliance without pedigree. "You should sleep, hijo," Miguel would whisper. "I can't," Samuel would answer without looking up. "It's louder when I close my eyes." What is louder? The equations. They move. If I don't write them, they'll vanish. Miguel would sigh, kiss his son's hair, and collapse onto the cot. The boy's pencil scratches filled the silence until dawn. At school, Samuel was invisible when he was lucky and ridiculed when he wasn't. He wore second-hand shoes that squeaked when wet, and his accent carried traces of his father's homeland. Children can be merciless with difference. "Hey, janitor's kid, clean the board for us." "Think Harvard's gonna put your name on a building? You don't belong there, not even as trash." Their laughter clung to him like soot. Samuel never fought back. He simply lowered his head, clutching his notebook tighter, as though the numbers within could shield him. Mathematics became his refuge, the one place where voices fell silent. Equations did not mock. Proofs did not sneer. In their cold precision, Samuel found mercy. But inside that mercy burned fire. Each insult, each shove in the hallway became fuel. He scribbled harder, carved deeper into the pages, pressing symbols until the pencil broke. He began to see beauty in what others feared: turbulence, infinity, unsolved conjectures that devoured careers. To him, they were not walls, they were doors. He had no friends, save one, the blackboard. At night, while others slept, it waited for him in the silence of Harvard's mathematics wing. Its surface bore no judgment. It demanded nothing but courage and chalk. When Samuel stood before it, he was not the janitor's kid. He was a mind unshackled, but Harvard was not blind. Though the professors had not yet seen him, the world beyond their equations had begun whispering. Even in Somerville, rumors floated. There's a boy sneaking into Harvard at night. A janitor's kid who thinks he's smarter than the professors. Miguel heard them too. He confronted Samuel once, after finding chalk dust smeared across his son's sleeves. Tell me the truth. Have you been inside? Samuel froze. His hands tightened around the stub of pencil he was holding. Yes, he whispered. Miguel closed his eyes. Pain cut deeper than anger. Do you know what they'll do to you if they find out? Samuel's reply was quiet but unflinching. Then let them. I'd rather be caught with chalk on my hands than live with silence in my head. Miguel turned away, shoulders trembling. He had mopped floors for 20 years, swallowed humiliation in silence, so his son might never taste it. Yet here Samuel was, risking everything for a dream written in symbols. That night, Miguel wept quietly on his cot. Samuel heard him but did not move. The boy's heart twisted, but his resolve only hardened. Morning came like an intruder. Samuel returned to his own school, bleary-eyed, carrying the weight of midnight secrets. Teachers scolded him for daydreaming. He pretended to listen, but his mind was elsewhere, tracing invisible equations on the fogged window with his fingertip, replaying each stroke of chalk he had carved into Harvard's blackboard hours before. In the cafeteria, he sat alone, lunch tray untouched. A group of boys passed by, laughing. One of them whispered loudly, "That's the kid whose dad cleans Harvard toilets." The words struck harder than fists. Samuel bent lower over his notebook, scribbling until the letters blurred. He was nameless to them. A shadow. But in the solitude of equations, he was something else. On the way home, Samuel walked past Harvard Yard. Students hurried by in coats worth more than his rent, their voices filled with careless ease. He lingered at the gates, fingers gripping the cold iron bars. To them, he was invisible. To him, they were giants on the other side of a chasm money had carved. Yet beyond those bars lay the blackboard. And on the blackboard, his proof still glowed in his mind like fire in the dark. Samuel pressed his forehead to the iron. He whispered, as though to the stones themselves, "I don't need them to know my name. Not yet." The old clock chimed in the distance. 2 strokes, faint and hollow. And the boy walked on, already planning his return to the shadows. Morning broke across Cambridge with the usual authority. The bells rang, bicycles clattered on cobblestones, and Harvard awoke as if its walls themselves inhaled sunlight. Professor Aldous Harrington, chair of the mathematics department, arrived earlier than most. His routine had not changed in 40 years. Black coffee from Au Bon Pain, the Boston Globe folded twice under his arm, and a ring of keys that clinked with the solemnity of ritual. He disliked surprises. Mathematics, after all, was supposed to be the science of inevitability. Yet when he entered Lecture Hall B that morning, inevitability shattered. There, sprawling across the blackboard, was a proof. At first glance, Harrington thought one of his colleagues had worked late, perhaps attempting to untangle the turbulence conjecture they had debated the week prior. But the handwriting stopped him cold. It was not the neat economical script of a trained academic. It was hesitant in places, urgent in others, as though the hand had trembled yet refused to surrender. Still, the structure was undeniable, each line built upon the last with an intuition that felt alien, almost feral. The chalk strokes curved like rivers, flowing toward a destination no map had predicted. Harrington set down his newspaper. His eyes narrowed. Who had done this? He leaned closer, tracing the path with his finger without touching the dust. He knew every graduate student's habits, every colleague's eccentricities. This was no one he recognized. And yet, the logic. Dear God, the logic. Harrington felt his pulse quicken, something that had not happened in years. For decades, his career had been built upon meticulous caution. He published what could be defended, what could not be torn down. But this proof carried a boldness he had almost forgotten existed. It leapt across gaps where others hesitated, bridged chaos with intuition. It was reckless, perhaps, but brilliant. He pulled a chair, sat heavily, and stared. Minutes stretched into an hour. The globe lay forgotten, coffee cooling. The janitor entered quietly to mop the floors. Harrington barely noticed until the man paused, eyes flicking curiously to the board. Then, almost reverently, the janitor bowed his head, as though recognizing something sacred, and returned to his work without a word. By the time the first students arrived, Harrington had made his decision. The board would not be erased. Not yet. He wanted to test it, to see if the wild intuition held. He copied the lines feverishly into his own notebook, each symbol biting into the paper like a secret carved in haste. Still, questions gnawed at him. Who had trespassed here? Why had they fled before morning? And why, when he looked at the strokes again, did he sense not the hand of a seasoned scholar, but of someone young? Word spread quickly. Students filed in, eyes widening. Who wrote that? Looks like a prank. No professor I know writes like that. Whispers rippled through the room. Some laughed, dismissing it as graffiti dressed in numbers. Others stared longer, unsettled. By noon, the rumor had reached the faculty lounge. A blackboard in Lecture Hall B bore a mysterious proof of startling originality. Harrington endured the jokes of colleagues who teased that he had staged it himself for attention. But deep down, he knew. The handwriting was not his, nor any man or woman he knew. It haunted him. That evening, long after the students had gone, Harrington returned to the lecture hall. The room was dark, shadows stretching across the rows of empty chairs. The board still stood, covered in symbols like constellations against a night sky. He closed the door softly, as though afraid to disturb it. For the first time in years, Harrington felt small. He was not confronting a rival, nor a peer, but a phantom. Someone had walked into Harvard unseen, had dared to stand where giants lectured, and had left behind brilliance as proof of existence. And as he sat there, beneath the ticking of the old clock, one thought pierced him. If such a mind existed beyond the walls of this institution, and if Harvard failed to see it, then perhaps the world was not as orderly as mathematics promised. Harrington pressed his palm against the cool wood of the desk. Somewhere, someone had written a secret into his domain. And tomorrow night, he resolved, he would return. This time, he would not let the phantom vanish before dawn. Night fell early in Cambridge. A thin mist crept along the Charles, swallowing the lamps that lined the river. Harvard's courtyards emptied as students retreated to dormitories, their voices fading into the hum of heaters and the rustle of books. By midnight, the mathematics wing was once again a cathedral of silence. But Professor Aldous Harrington remained awake. He had spent the day replaying the mysterious proof in his mind, each line like a melody he could not shake. It carried the fingerprints of genius, but not the polish of experience. Whoever had written it was raw, untrained, almost feral in their brilliance. Harrington needed to know. And so, he waited. The lecture hall was dark save for the bluish haze of moonlight seeping through high windows. Harrington sat in the back row, his frame stiff, his breath shallow. The old clock ticked toward 2. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the pipes felt amplified, as though the building itself conspired to test his patience. Then, footsteps. Soft, hesitant, like a stray afraid of being caught. The door handle turned with a faint click. Harrington leaned forward, pulse quickening. A boy slipped inside. He could not have been more than 12, thin, almost fragile, his shirt too large for his small frame. Chalk dust still clung to his sleeve, as if it belonged there as naturally as skin. He glanced around, eyes sharp with caution, then moved toward the blackboard with the familiarity of someone returning home. Harrington froze. The boy dragged a chair across the floor with a low groan, climbed onto it and reached for the chalk. His hand trembled at first, but once the chalk touched slate, movement overtook fear. Symbols began to form, hesitant, then certain, then flowing like water. The professor's breath caught. It was him, the phantom. For minutes, Harrington sat spellbound, torn between awe and disbelief. This was not mimicry. This was thought unfolding in real time, intuition sparking into form. The boy worked with the reckless courage of someone who had nothing to lose. A piece of chalk snapped, scattering white shards across the floor. The boy cursed under his breath, bent to grab another, and then he saw him. From the shadows of the back row, the professor's silhouette rose, tall, severe, outlined in the faint silver of moonlight. Their eyes locked across the dark hall. The boy froze. His lips parted, but no sound came. The chalk slipped from his hand and fell to the floor with a sharp crack that echoed louder than any shout. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The boy's chest heaved. Harrington's gaze was steady, unreadable. It was the collision of 2 worlds, one clothed in centuries of prestige, the other in rags and silence. At last, the professor spoke, his voice low, grave. "Who are you?" The boy stammered, words tumbling out like broken glass. I'm nobody." "Your handwriting says otherwise." Harrington stepped forward, his shoes echoing against the stone floor. "That proof on the board. Did you write it?" The boy's eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating escape. But the professor's presence filled the room, immovable. His voice cracked. "Yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than the walls themselves. Harrington searched the boy's face, half defiant, half terrified. This was not a prank, not a trick. This was a mind unchained by fear, caught in the act of trespassing against a world that had already dismissed him. The professor reached the first row, the moon catching the gray in his beard. He stopped just a few feet from the boy. "Do you understand," Harrington said softly, "what it is you've written?" The boy swallowed, eyes burning. "I understand enough." Harrington studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the blackboard. The unfinished lines seemed to glow in the dark, waiting. He turned back. "Show me." The boy hesitated. His small hand hovered over the chalk fragments on the floor. His shoulders trembled. "Go on," the professor urged, voice firmer now. "If you truly understand, prove it." The boy bent, picked up a new piece of chalk, and gripped it so tightly his knuckles whitened. He climbed back onto the chair, lifted his arm, and began to write. Each stroke shook, yet the logic built upon itself. His breathing steadied. For a moment, the fear faded, replaced by the same fire that had driven him into this forbidden place night after night. Behind him, Harrington watched in silence, something long dormant stirring in his chest. Wonder. The old clock struck 2. Its hollow chime rolled through the hall, sealing the moment into history. And in that fragile hour, a boy and a professor stood on opposite sides of destiny, one writing desperately against invisibility, the other witnessing the impossible unfold before his eyes. The silence after the clock's chime seemed endless. The boy's hand hovered above the chalkboard, his body trembling like a candle's flame in a draught. Behind him, Professor Harrington stood immovable, his eyes hard as granite yet burning with questions. At last, the boy lowered the chalk, stepping down from the chair as though surrendering to judgment. The chalk dust smeared across his sleeve like evidence he could not wash away. Harrington's voice cut through the darkness. "Who taught you?" The boy shook his head quickly. "No one." The professor frowned. "Impossible. You don't stumble into Navier-Stokes. You don't accidentally reach for turbulence." "I didn't stumble," the boy whispered. His voice was fragile but carried a strange steadiness beneath it. "I read. I watched. I thought." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Read what? From where?" The boy hesitated. His mind flashed with images, discarded textbooks salvaged from dumpsters, lecture notes stolen from recycling bins, nights pressing his face to the library window to glimpse the chalkboards left behind. He could not confess all that. "Books," he said at last. "Wherever I could find them." Harrington studied him. The boy's answers were too raw to be rehearsed. Still, suspicion gnawed at him. He had spent his life training students, bright ones, privileged ones, but even they needed years to grasp such depths. And here stood a boy in threadbare clothes, claiming mastery where grown scholars faltered. "You expect me to believe," Harrington said slowly, "that you taught yourself? That without a teacher, without instruction, you devised methods I've seen only in the most advanced papers?" The boy lifted his chin. Fear flickered, but pride flared brighter. "I don't expect you to believe anything. The math doesn't care what you believe." The words struck Harrington like a slap. For a moment his face betrayed nothing. Then his lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite anger, something caught between. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. If you copied this from somewhere, admit it now, because if you stand before me with lies, you'll be crushed under the weight of them. No institution, no man, will forgive a fraud." "I didn't copy," the boy said, each syllable deliberate. "I don't even have anything to copy from." The professor's brow furrowed. There it was again, that defiant honesty, spoken not as arrogance but as truth carved from survival. Harrington felt the stir of something uncomfortable. Doubt. Not of the boy, but of himself. He turned back to the blackboard, running his eyes along the proof. Line after line. Bold leaps, sharp turns, unconventional but undeniably coherent as no textbook could have supplied this exact sequence. It was not imitation. It was creation. Yet still, Harrington needed to be sure. He seized a piece of chalk, the dust coating his fingers, and turned sharply. "Then prove it." The boy blinked. "What?" "Explain it to me," Harrington commanded. "Line by line. If this truly came from your mind, you should walk me through it without hesitation." Samuel's throat tightened. His small hands clenched, then released. He stepped back to the board, eyes darting across the equations he had written. He pointed. "Here, this part. Everyone tries to linearize too early. That's why it fails. But if you hold the nonlinearity longer, like holding your breath underwater, you can carry it further before it collapses. Harrington frowned, intrigued despite himself. Go on. The boy moved along the board, his words tumbling faster now, his fear melting into fervor. See? This symmetry, it looks unstable, but it isn't. It balances itself if you rotate the frame, like spinning a coin. It wobbles, but it doesn't fall until friction stops it. The professor's breath slowed. He recognized analogies no textbook taught, images pulled from a child's world, yet strikingly apt. Where scholars wrote in rigid formalisms, this boy translated chaos into playground metaphors. When Samuel reached the final line, his voice faltered. The explanation ended in silence. He turned, eyes wide, chest heaving. For a long moment, Harrington said nothing. He simply stared. The boy braced himself, waiting for scorn, for dismissal, for the weight of Harvard to crush him. Instead, Harrington whispered, "Good God." He stepped back, hand pressed to his brow. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of an abyss, not of ignorance but of discovery, staring into depths his own discipline had never reached. And the guide into that abyss was a janitor's son. But the professor's awe was not free of fear. He knew the world outside these walls. A child like this, unshielded, would be devoured by doubt, by ridicule, by the merciless machinery of academia. He forced his face back into severity, masking the tremor in his chest. "This isn't enough," Harrington said at last, his tone heavy with authority. "One explanation doesn't make you a mathematician. If you are what you claim, if this brilliance is truly yours, then you must face something harder." The boy's brows knit. "Harder?" Harrington turned, seized the chalk again, and began writing a new problem on the far end of the board. His strokes were sharp, precise, cutting into the slate like steel. "This," he said, stepping back, "something even my best graduate students cannot solve in a night. If you truly belong here, show me." The boy stared at the problem. His throat tightened, his palms dampened. The symbols seemed enormous, looming like mountains against the blackboard. But in his chest, that old fire stirred. The same fire that had driven him across the Charles at night, that had silenced the jeers of classmates, that had carried him into this forbidden hall. He stepped forward, lifted the chalk. His hand trembled. Behind him, the professor's gaze bore down like judgment. The old clock ticked toward 2 once more. The new problem stretched across the far end of the blackboard like a wall of stone. Harrington's chalk strokes were clean, merciless, cutting through slate with the precision of a man who had spent his life wielding equations as weapons. Samuel stood before it, his small frame dwarfed by symbols that twisted like serpents. His hand trembled around the chalk, his throat dry. "This," Harrington said, folding his arms, "cannot be solved in one night. Even the best of my graduate students would need weeks." His voice echoed against the empty hall, filling it with authority. Yet beneath the sternness lay something he did not admit even to himself, a spark of hope. He wanted, needed, to know if this boy's defiance was real. Samuel swallowed hard. His eyes scanned the board. Each term was a mountain, each operator a cliff. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the hierarchy of Harvard, the mockery of classmates, the weariness of his father's bent back. But louder than all of that was the whisper inside his chest. "You've come too far to stop now." He climbed onto the chair again. The wood groaned beneath him, as though protesting his audacity. He raised the chalk. For long minutes, he could not move. The old clock ticked in the silence, steady and cruel. Harrington's gaze was fixed, unyielding. Finally, Samuel pressed chalk to slate. A line, then another. Hesitant, clumsy, but alive. He began with what he knew, tiny footholds carved into the cliff. He recalled scraps of papers he had studied under candlelight, diagrams glimpsed through library windows. His mind stitched fragments together, building scaffolds where none existed. But soon the problem deepened, twisting into uncharted waters. Samuel faltered. He stepped back, heart hammering. The board swam before him. Doubt surged like a tide. Maybe I don't belong. Maybe this is too much. From behind, Harrington spoke, his tone cutting. I told you, this is beyond you. The words struck Samuel harder than any blow. He closed his eyes. And in that darkness, he saw his father, Miguel, pushing a mop across the same Harvard halls. He saw the ridicule of classmates, the iron bars of the gates he pressed his forehead against. He saw every closed door, and he opened his eyes. No, he whispered. He gripped the chalk tighter, returned to the board, and drew again. His strokes grew surer, his breathing steady. He tried a new angle, twisting the problem like a puzzle box. He failed. He erased. He tried again. Sweat slid down his temple, dripping onto the floor. Time bled away. The clock struck 1:30. The board was a battlefield, half-erased attempts, broken chalk scattered at his feet. His fingers were white with dust, his nails bitten raw. Still, he pressed on. Each attempt carved deeper into his resolve. Each failure birthed another approach. He spoke under his breath, analogies tumbling out. It's like holding balance on ice. No, like tethering a kite in a storm. If I anchor here, the wind won't pull it apart. Harrington listened, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, wonder at the sight of raw thought being forged in real time, unfiltered, untrained, pure. By now, any ordinary student would have collapsed. But Samuel refused to surrender. At last, nearing 2, he landed on a structure that held. His lines curved into place. Not a full proof. No, not yet. But the skeleton of an idea, a bridge spanning the abyss. It was fragile, incomplete, but undeniably original. He dropped the chalk, his chest heaving, sweat dripping onto the cold floor. I can't finish tonight, Samuel whispered hoarsely. But I can see where it goes. Harrington stepped forward, studying the half-born solution. His heart thudded. It wasn't complete, but the boy had carved a path no one else had dared. The clock struck 2. The sound filled the hall, binding them both in the silence of that hour. Samuel stood trembling, barely able to stay upright. Yet his eyes, dark, burning, held steady on the board, as if daring it to defy him. Harrington looked at him long, searching. What he saw was not fraud, not mimicry, but something more dangerous. Truth. At last, the professor spoke, his voice almost reverent. You may not have finished, but you have done enough to terrify me. Samuel blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Harrington turned toward the board again, his face half-shadowed, half-illuminated by moonlight. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of history shifting, not in conferences or journals, but in the trembling hand of a janitor's son at 2 a.m. Morning light crept across Harvard Yard, turning frost into shards of fire. Students hurried between classes, clutching books, yawning into paper cups of coffee. Life at the university moved with its usual rhythm, except in the mathematics wing. Whispers had begun. It started with a graduate assistant, bleary-eyed from grading, who stumbled into lecture hall B before dawn and froze. The blackboard was no longer a board. It was a storm of chalk. Half-erased attempts, furious strokes, strange analogies scrawled in the margins. There was desperation in the handwriting, but also vision. Something alive, something untrained yet fierce. The assistant whispered about it in the lounge. By noon, the story had spread. Someone was breaking into Harvard at night. Someone was solving problems professors left unsolved. Some laughed. "A prank! Has to be." Others smirked. Probably Harrington staging drama again. But a few lowered their voices. No professor writes like that. It looks young. Young. The word lingered like smoke. By the end of the week, the rumor had evolved into myth. They called it the Phantom of 2 a.m. In cafeterias, students speculated. Maybe it's an eccentric grad student. Maybe a dropout sneaks back in. No. What if it's a janitor's kid? The last suggestion drew laughter, but nervous laughter. No one could explain why it made their stomachs twist. Some claimed to have seen him. A shadow slipping through corridors, a faint squeak of shoes at impossible hours, a boy climbing onto a chair to reach the board. Others dismissed it, but the legend grew. By night, the hallways filled with silent witnesses. Clusters of students hid behind pillars, daring each other to stay awake until the clock struck 2. Their breath fogged the air, their hearts raced, waiting. And when the boy appeared, thin, silent, with chalk dust on his sleeve, their whispers died. They watched him climb onto the chair, raise the chalk, and carve symbols into silence. The sound was almost holy. Krt, krt, krt. Some scoffed. "It's nonsense." Others leaned closer. "No, look, he's building something." The boy never turned. He never acknowledged the crowd. To him, the blackboard was the only audience. Professor Harrington heard the whispers too. He walked the halls with heavier steps now, his eyes sharp for intruders. Yet inside, a conflict tore him apart. He had spent a lifetime defending Harvard's gates, ensuring only the chosen few entered. But the boy was no chosen one. He was trespasser, outcast, an interloper who should have been swept away with chalk dust. And yet, Harrington had seen the fire in the boy's mind. He had set the trial, and the boy had not faltered. What he glimpsed was not fraud, but genius. Raw, unrefined, dangerous, but genius nonetheless. Each night, as he returned to watch in secret, Harrington felt his own certainty unravel. Meanwhile, the administration was less romantic. Rumors reached the dean's office. "A child writing on our boards at night? A janitor's son? Do you know what this does to our reputation?" Meetings were held in paneled rooms, voices sharpened. "If this is true, it undermines us. Harvard cannot be made into a circus. Shut it down." The enemy was not a villain with a sneer. It was bureaucracy, prestige, the machinery that guarded its own myth. For the boy, faceless and nameless, the walls were closing in. One evening, Samuel arrived earlier than usual. As he pushed open the heavy door, his heart froze. The corridor was already full. Dozens of students lined the walls, waiting, their eyes fixed on him as though watching an apparition. Whispers rippled. "It's him. The Phantom. The janitor's kid." Samuel's throat tightened. For the first time, he felt the weight of being seen. He wanted to flee, but the board called to him. He climbed the chair, lifted the chalk, and began. His hand shook harder than usual. Every mistake felt magnified by their eyes. Yet as the equations grew, silence deepened. Even those who had come to mock leaned forward, drawn unwillingly into the gravity of his work. And when the clock struck 2, the sound did not echo through emptiness. It resounded through a hall filled with breathless witnesses, each one realizing they were watching something forbidden, perhaps even historic. The legend of the 2 a.m. phantom was no longer rumor. It was alive. In the ivory towers of Harvard, danger did not arrive with shouts or fists. It arrived with whispers. By the time the phantom of 2 a.m. had become the talk of the yard, the story had already seeped into the oak-paneled chambers of the administration. There, beneath oil portraits of benefactors and deans long dead, men and women in tailored suits sat in leather chairs, their voices clipped, their expressions sharper than any blade. "This cannot continue," one trustee declared, tapping the polished table with his ring. "Harvard is not a playground for janitors' children." "A myth like this undermines us," another said. "If the public believes a child, unschooled, is solving problems our professors leave unfinished, what does that say about us?" "It says the truth," someone murmured, but the words were drowned beneath a tide of scorn. For them, the enemy was not ignorance, but disruption. Prestige had to be guarded, polished like the bronze gates at the entrance. Anything that threatened the sanctity of that image, no matter how brilliant, was a stain to be scrubbed away. And so the decision was whispered into being. Find the boy, silence the rumors, restore the order. Professor Harrington was summoned. He stood before the board of trustees, his shoulders rigid, his mind aflame with conflict. "You know of this child?" the dean demanded. Harrington's jaw tightened. He thought of Samuel's trembling hand, the chalk breaking against slate, the eyes burning with defiance. He thought of the courage it took for a boy to stand against centuries of exclusion. At last he answered carefully, "I know only that someone, remarkable, has written proofs we cannot ignore." A scoff rippled through the room. "Remarkable or reckless? Either way, this cannot be tolerated. Harvard's reputation, our legacy, must not be compromised by a janitor's son sneaking into classrooms." The words struck Harrington like poison. He had devoted his life to this institution, had once believed its glory untouchable. But in that moment he saw clearly. The enemy was not the boy. The enemy was this machine of prestige, this invisible hand that would rather protect marble walls than nurture genius. Harrington left the meeting with the weight of centuries pressing on his back. Meanwhile, the whispers reached Samuel too. He overheard students in the cafeteria. "The administration's cracking down. They'll catch him soon." Others smirked. "Good. He doesn't belong here." Each word was a dagger. For Samuel, Harvard had never been a place of belonging. It had been a battlefield. But now the battlefield had generals he could not see, soldiers he could not fight. At home, his father noticed the change. "You're restless, hijo," Miguel said, setting down the mop handle he carried even at home like an extension of himself. Samuel looked up, his face pale, his hands white with chalk dust. "They'll take it away from me." Miguel frowned. "Take what?" "The board, the chance, the only place I feel real." His father's eyes softened with sorrow. He reached out, rough hands cupping his son's cheek. "Listen to me. Harvard is a building. Chalk is a stone that crumbles. But your mind is a river. They cannot dam it, no matter how high they build their walls." Samuel tried to believe him, but the fear lingered. That night, the crowd in the mathematics wing was larger than ever. Students pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispering, daring, waiting for the phantom to appear. And when Samuel entered, silence fell like a curtain. Dozens of eyes followed his every move. Some glared with contempt, others with awe. He climbed the chair, lifted the chalk. His hand trembled more than ever beneath their gaze. From the back of the hall, Harrington watched. His chest ached. He could see the boy's courage fraying beneath the weight of invisible enemies, prestige, bureaucracy, ridicule. And yet, Samuel began to write. Kurt, Kurt, Kurt. Each stroke of chalk was defiance. Each line was a refusal to disappear. The old clock struck 2. The crowd did not cheer, nor jeer. They only watched, held by a silence that was larger than them all. But in the dean's office, plans were already in motion. Letters drafted, policies sharpened, rules prepared to fall like a guillotine. The phantom would not be allowed to haunt Harvard much longer. The enemy was faceless, nameless, but suffocating. And Samuel, though he did not yet know it, was walking straight into its jaws. Harvard's grand lecture hall was not meant for children. Its vaulted ceiling arched like a cathedral, chandeliers casting gold light across rows of oak benches. Portraits of scholars long dead watched from the walls, their eyes stern, as though guarding the sanctity of intellect itself. On this morning, the hall was packed. Professors, graduate students, visiting mathematicians, all had gathered for the annual colloquium of pure mathematics, an event where reputations were sharpened or shattered. The air was charged with anticipation, murmurs rising like static. Professor Harrington sat near the front, his face grim. He had resisted, argued, even pleaded, but the decision had been made above him. The boy would be tested in public. If he failed, the myth would collapse, the phantom dismissed as a fraud. Order would be restored. And if he succeeded, the thought tightened Harrington's chest. The dean rose first, his voice solemn. Today we present a challenge, one that has resisted solution for decades. Let this be a reminder of the heights to which mathematics aspires. On the blackboard gleamed a single problem, a conjecture whispered of in journals, feared by students, worshipped by scholars, an equation so twisted it seemed alive, a serpent coiled upon itself. The audience leaned forward, pens poised, eyes sharpened. Then a hush rippled through the hall. From the side door, a boy entered, small, frail, his clothes plain, his shoes worn. His steps faltered under the weight of hundreds of stairs. For an instant he looked as though he might turn and flee. Whispers filled the air. Is that him? He's just a child. A janitor's son. This is absurd. Samuel's face burned. His knees shook. He gripped the strap of his worn satchel as though it were a lifeline. At the front, Harrington rose. His voice cut through the noise. You've come this far. Don't look at them. Look at the board. Samuel's eyes flicked upward. The blackboard loomed like a mountain, symbols gleaming under chandelier light. He stepped forward, each footfall echoing too loudly in the vast hall. He climbed the small wooden platform meant for lecturers, its surface far too big for his frame. His fingers brushed the chalk. Cold. Fragile. The silence thickened until he could hear his own heartbeat. He raised the chalk. The first line trembled. Murmurs rose at once. He doesn't know what he's doing. It's child's play. But Samuel pressed on, his strokes steadied. One line became 2, 2 became 10. His breathing slowed, his body leaning into rhythm. Kurt, Kurt, Kurt. The sound filled the hall like the tolling of a bell. What began as mockery turned into murmurs of confusion, then silence. The boy was not copying. He was building. Each line followed from the last with a logic raw but undeniable. Where professors hesitated, he leapt. Where tradition demanded caution, he carved new paths. The board transformed into a storm of chalk. His small frame blurred, his arm rising and falling, sweat dripping down his temple. He paused, erased, rewrote, pressed harder until the chalk splintered in his grip. Minutes stretched into an hour. The chandeliers blazed overhead, but to Samuel, There was only the blackboard and the whisper of equations that had haunted him since childhood. He thought of his father, bent over a mop, whispering, "Your mind is a river." He thought of the jeers, janitor's kid. He thought of the nights at 2 a.m., when the world forgot him and the board became his only witness. And he wrote as if the world depended on it. When at last he dropped the chalk, the board was filled edge to edge. Equations looped like constellations, proof lines bridging chaos into order. His chest heaved, his hands white with dust. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the room erupted. Some shouted in disbelief, "Impossible!" Others surged forward, eyes wide. "It holds! Look at this symmetry!" A few professors buried their faces in their hands, shaken by the audacity of it all. Harrington stood frozen. His throat closed, his heart pounding. He had known the boy was gifted, but this was no longer survival. This was revelation. At the center of it all, Samuel stood trembling, unsure whether he had triumphed or doomed himself. The crowd's roar pressed down on him, a storm he could not control. And then, slowly, impossibly, a sound rose above it. Applause. It began with one pair of hands, then another, then dozens. The hall shook with thunderous clapping, echoing against marble walls, reverberating beneath portraits of dead scholars who had never imagined such a moment. Samuel's eyes blurred with tears. For the first time, he was not invisible. High above, the old clock struck 2. The sound rolled across the hall, binding the moment into legend. At precisely 2 a.m., history had been written, not by the privileged, not by the professors, but by the trembling hand of a janitor's son. When the applause finally ebbed, the lecture hall felt changed, as though the air itself had been rewritten. For a moment, Harvard, with its centuries of tradition, had yielded to something purer. Truth, born in chalk dust. Samuel stood trembling on the platform, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands raw and white with dust. He wanted to disappear into the shadows as always, but there was no hiding now. Hundreds of eyes had seen him. Hundreds of hearts had felt the shock of his defiance. And among them, one pair of eyes brimmed with tears. Miguel had slipped into the hall unnoticed, summoned by whispers he scarcely believed. He had pushed his mop for 2 decades, bent his back to the cold floors of Harvard, never imagining his son would climb higher than marble columns. Yet here Samuel stood, before chandeliers and portraits, chalk in hand, writing his name into eternity. Miguel pressed his fist against his mouth to stifle the sob that rose. His boy, the janitor's boy, had shattered the silence of centuries. But not everyone applauded. In the corner, administrators huddled, their faces pale, their voices harsh whispers. "This is dangerous. The press will devour it. Harvard cannot be upstaged by a child." Their words were drowned by the thunder of clapping, but the threat remained. Prestige is stubborn. It does not yield without a fight. Professor Harrington knew it. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his voice rising above the noise. "You see, before you, not a phantom, not a trespasser, but a mathematician, one who has earned his place here, not through lineage, not through wealth, but through the courage to face the board at 2 a.m. The hall stilled. The declaration hung in the air, irrevocable. The boy turned, eyes wide. For so long he had carried his genius in secret, in silence, in shadows. To hear it named aloud, to hear it claimed by a voice of authority, felt unreal. Samuel whispered, almost to himself, "I'm not invisible anymore." That night, the story spread beyond Harvard. Students carried it in whispers to cafes, to newspapers, to the city streets. A janitor's child solved what no professor could. The phantom of 2 a.m. is real. It leapt across rivers and oceans, sparking awe and anger in equal measure. Some hailed it as proof that genius can rise from anywhere. Others scorned it as a humiliation to the academy. But no one could ignore it. And so the legend grew. Weeks later, in a smaller, quieter ceremony, Samuel was invited into a classroom, not as an intruder, but as a student. His name was written on the roll for the first time. His father sat in the back, cap in hand, tears streaking down his weathered cheeks. It was not riches nor fame that mattered. It was belonging. Years would pass, and scholars would recall the night the chandeliers lit a trembling boy with chalk-stained fingers. They would call it the 2 a.m. proof. Some would study it, some would debate it, but all would remember. The boy became a man, and his life wound through paths neither he nor his father could have dreamed. But he never forgot. And sometimes, late at night, when the halls of Harvard lay silent once more, he would return to the blackboard, not to prove anything to anyone, but to listen to the whisper of equations, to feel again the silence where it had all begun. The old clock would strike 2, but now he was never alone. Beside him stood students who once doubted, professors who once scoffed, and always, always, his father, watching with eyes full of pride. The legend of 2 a.m. was not carved in marble, nor written in journals. It lived in memory, in whispers, in the quiet courage of every outcast who ever dared to pick up a piece of chalk and defy the world. History had not been written in daylight, under banners and titles. It had been written at 2 a.m. in chalk dust by the trembling hand of a janitor's child. Dear friends, if this story touched you, remember, it was never only about Harvard or chalk or a clock striking 2. It is about every soul the world has overlooked, every child who dares to dream where no door seems open. If you believe, as I do, that hidden brilliance deserves to be seen, please subscribe to this channel, share this story, and keep the legend alive, because somewhere tonight at 2 a.m., another forgotten child is holding a piece of chalk, and history is waiting.